Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
So thank you very much for coming. Just out of curiosity, before we even start with intros, how many of you attended workshops yesterday or the day before with Berkeley Media Studies Group on some of the research that we've done on strategic ways to frame prevention communication? Okay, great. So 30 or so. Shameless plug. Today's workshop is going to hopefully provide you with some opportunities to practice operationalizing some of the things that we've been talking about in those workshops and give you some things that you can take home with you to practice. Because what we have found is practice is really what helps us break our own bad habits, all of us. So hopefully we're gonna give you some things to use there. My name's Kristen Hauser. I'm the Chief Public Affairs Officer at Raliance and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and also the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape.
Thank you, Kristen. And I'm Julie Patrick, the National Partners Liaison for Raliance in the DC office.
There we go. Great. So quickly today, we're going to try to help us identify frequently used field lingo. We have some lists. You have some examples at your table. These are not an exhaustive collection. You will all figure out what other ones your organization uses or what your go-to words are. So the idea is to figure out some of these frequently used words and phrases that are very familiar to us but are probably not familiar to audiences. And then we're going to figure out how to replace them or say them differently so that we're connecting. We're going to talk about emphasizing only facts when we're presenting information. Just a quick show of hands. Do any of you still have a myths and facts section of your website or handouts that you're passing out? All right, those of you with your hands in your air, you have a homework assignment when you leave, when you go back home. We're going to change that a little bit. But we're going to talk about how people are perceiving information through what they already believe, which we know are most of the myths. So we're going to be strategic about how we're correcting that information and conveying what we really need people to know. And then lastly, we're going to practice answering some common questions in ways that limit neutralizing language or sanitizing language. And this is a way to, number one, continue to instill facts, which we need to help people really understand and accept the basic components of prevention. People need to understand how these crimes or these incidents happen. And keep offender accountability front and center. You don't need to use the word offender accountability, those we'll get into, but for the sake of brevity on the slide, with a familiar crowd, we figured we would go ahead and do that. Great.
Sure. Okay. So if you were in the plenary earlier today, you already heard all about Raliance, but just a brief recap. We're about advancing research, influencing policy, supporting prevention programs that are innovative, replicable, that you can take back into your communities. We're also helping leaders establish safe workplaces and stronger communities, and partnering with a wide range of organizations, and hopefully with you. And a little bit about BMSG, I guess, is next. Since they've been partnering. So all of this has been culminating with, 5 years worth of research and work together, starting with news analyses and thinking through how we could do a better job of communicating effectively about prevention. And just a shout out to our friends at BMSG over here along the wall. And I see Lori in the back, and yeah, yay. They're fantastic to work with. So what Berkeley Media Studies Group does is that they research media coverage of public health and social justice issues. That kind of advocacy training is incredible for really thinking differently about how we just even define things, talk about things, how we can frame things for the public to be able to ingest it in more bite-sized ways. So the professional education for journalists is a huge part of that. We're also very much involved in that with Raliance because we understand that that is a voice piece for the public to understand these issues better.
So a little bit of expert or information about our role with Raliance. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center is one of the 3 partners in Raliance, and we've had the opportunity to participate in some of the research that's been going on, not only with Berkeley Media Studies Group, but early on we did some work with the Frameworks Institute to help identify gaps between what experts know about our field and this issue and what the public thinks that they know about this issue. And so once we had identified that gap, now we needed to figure out how to bridge it. We've also been doing an awful lot of work with journalists around the country and some internationally as well. We partnered with the Poynter Institute to put together a basic online training of an introduction on how to cover issues of sexual assault for reporters. We are working directly with reporters, and we've also been on site doing media coverage and giving expert content at the Cosby trial, the Sandusky trial, and the Steubenville trial. So we've had staff on site there. So we've learned a lot flying by the seat of our pants working in those environments. And then certainly reaching the public, we've had the opportunity to be working with some public relations consultants who've helped us refine our skills in how we speak to the media, helping us identify some of the terminology that we thought was awesome, and they let us know that it wasn't, which was great, so we had to rework some of that. And then developing key messages, practicing how to say it, practicing how to integrate those key messages into all of the different opportunities we have to talk about this issue, and really recognizing that message saturation is what we all need to be doing to help move the needle in what America understands about this issue. And then finally, with our Sexual Assault Awareness Month campaign, we've had a lot of opportunity to see what works, what's resonating, what's getting retweeted, what's getting downloaded, what people are asking more of. So getting lots of feedback from communities around the country about what's resonating for them. Great.
Yeah, well, this is me. Yay. So what did we learn? People have complex and conflicting feelings about sexual violence. We knew that. And that the possibility of prevention might seem foreign or might be difficult. Those feelings and beliefs are shaped by life experiences, makes sense, and how they understand the problem as well and why it happens. So basically we learned that people know very little about our topic. This is often where those myths come in. And we've all heard them, right? Someone who commits a sexual offense, they're raised poorly, they're chemically imbalanced in some way. They have a narrow understanding of the dynamics at play, and this places all of the actions and the actors, all the actions on the actors, and doesn't really talk about choice. Because we know there's choices. There's choices in how we make decisions in our lives. There's choices also about how we can influence those who would choose to do things as well. So when we think about that, there is where, when, why, and how of someone who would possibly do harm. We also know that people need concrete examples of that to work. They need to see and feel prevention in a different way to make it believable and really see it in action. And people want to do their part because safety and well-being for others, especially for young people, is paramount for all of us. It's a shared value we all have. But that gets a little, confusing at times too, because we know that victim blaming is wrong, and we always start out with, it's never the victim's fault. And then what's the next thing that someone says? But I always tell my daughter to go out in a group if she's going to a bar. What does that do? Changes things. So when we're thinking about all of this, how can we change what the public takes in and how we express it to them? First and foremost, language. If people know very little about our topic and what we do, how can we break it down for them differently? Our language is technical, often academic, and can be nuanced and misleading to outsiders. How do we get back to simple? So I'm going to share something funny right now. Just take a second and read that. Yeah. Can you all see it? Don't use a big word when a singularly unloquacious and diminutive linguistic expression will satisfactorily accomplish the contemporary necessity. Did I say that all? Wow. You did. Marbles in my mouth. So how do we get to self-editing? So I'm going to tell you my journey story right now. I wear the badge of shame, the placard that says self-edit. And Kristen walks behind me with the cowbell, shame, shame. And I'm like, oh. So how do we get better at sound bites? How do we get better at making it break down and simple? And that's hard to do, but it's called practice. And that's what we're going to do today, too. So when we think about sexual violence, these imagery of what we think we're expressing isn't necessarily what people are picking up on. They're picking up on the physical violence. They're picking up not on the full spectrum of behaviors. They're going possibly to the most extremes, right? Because that's in their mind what they're thinking about. So when we hook people with concrete examples, we can really break that down for them in a way that we give them bite size and on-ramps to more information, right? So the self-editing part is recognizing that we need to leave breadcrumbs for people. We need to get them engaged and excited. And that's really hard because we have so much we need to say to everyone all the time about everything we know about this topic because we're so passionate about it. So I stand before you trying to reform myself in this process, and I am practicing with you. It's so very tempting to say everything. But it's impossible to be comprehensive and strategic at the same time. And that is the number one thing we want you to walk away from today. Our friends at BMSG have drilled this into us time and time again, that we have to be strategic. So let's focus on one aspect. Let's focus on communicating to be understood, no acronyms or academic language, and using impactful and illustrative phrases.
This really means that it doesn't matter what your role is in an organization. You might be talking to the media, you might be a fundraiser, you might be recruiting a new board member, you might be talking to the Kiwanis Club or a church group. Your job is to translate the expert PhD level information you have into user-friendly, beginner-level information that your audience needs. So this really is about translating. We really want to convey hope. We want people to feel like there's good results at the end of joining us in our mission and getting to the end and being a part of prevention. And if we're going to do that, we really need to deconstruct our field lingo and our academic terms. Do you want me to just go? Yes. Yeah, great. So as we start, I was saying, people often hear the information we're giving to them through the lens of what they already think they know to be true. I'll give you an example from my own family. Do you remember about a decade ago when Bill O'Reilly was on a rampage every night on the news saying over and over again, there's no cure for sex offenders? I mean, this was like a catchphrase that went through America. And so when I was talking to my dad about some of the work that I do, my father, who I will tell you does not watch Fox News, but my father said to me, well, isn't it true that there's no cure for sex offenders? So like he had heard that, he had internalized it, and he believed it because it had been repeated so often. So we had to really deconstruct that for Dad and explain like all the different things that were wrong with that statement. So people are hearing things through what they already believe to be true. So some little tips that we can give you are to find ways to keep what you have to say in a plain or kind of folksy presentation. Our first example up here is a real life thing. During the Sandusky trial, I did a live interview on In Session. It's like a court TV thing that they do in a trailer, right? So we went in and we did the interview. And the very last question I was asked, what can parents do to protect their children? I answered briefly, but I finished with saying, that when somebody gives us the heebie-jeebies that we need to pay attention. And as I was walking out of the trailer, my cell phone started vibrating. And the very first text message I got was from a colleague who I work with at PCAR, and she sent me a text message that said, "Did you seriously just say heebie-jeebies on national television?" And I wrote back and I said, yeah, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Like, the people that are at home watching television, everybody knows what the heebie-jeebies are. If I had used something a little more academic, a little more heady, referencing Gavin de Becker's Gift of Fear, not everybody knows that. So I purposefully picked a folksy phrase that it may have been a little quirky, but people pretty much know what that is. It's also helpful to find simplified phrases and reuse them. You can just integrate them into practically everything you say, every presentation, every interview, every time you answer a question. These are some examples of ones I use regularly. Saying sexual violence is a serious and widespread problem, or substitute whatever word is appropriate in there for violence, harassment, misconduct, abuse, assault. They're interchangeable. Pick the right one for your audience. But what do we know from America? People are still surprised that this happens so often, right? Have you seen a news story yet that says, community no longer surprised at allegations of sexual assault coming out of the school? I mean, every time it comes up, that people are expressing shock and bewilderment and really resisting that this is a common occurrence. So we did a lot of thinking and some research and thought about it, and we just decided we're just going to repeatedly tell the public this is a serious, widespread problem. This gets quoted. This has been quoted in national newspapers. I mean, I can start off any conversation utilizing this phrase. And when it becomes rote, that's when you get to like take a breath and organize your thoughts inside your head before you say the rest of your answer, because you're saying something that's easy and familiar. But this is just stating a fact, and you're going to back it up now by what you say afterwards. I sometimes use vulnerability as in the eye of the offender, or eye of the person who commits the crime, or whatever, again, phrase you want to use there. But people recognize that from beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So there sounds familiar there, but this is a nice way to counteract questions about risk reduction by explaining some of those behaviors and explaining how choices are strategically made. It's a nice lead-in. Prevention is possible and it's happening. Same thing. We know people don't really understand prevention and they're not sure it's possible. Because we hear people say, well, you're never going to end it all. Well, we're not saying we're going to end it all. We're saying we can end some, and everybody has a part to play. And if we all do it more often, we're going to end more. So we have to tell people that this is possible and it's happening, and then follow up with a concrete example that's pertinent to the topic you're talking about. So if you're talking about kids, you can talk about something that a parent can say when they're observing another adult be weird at a sporting event or in the school or responding to rumors. You want to give understandable, easy examples. I use this one all the time. Parents get really worried. How do I talk to my child about this? This is such a scary topic. So we need to normalize it for them and make it concrete. We talk to our kids about a lot of scary things: poison, fire, stranger abduction, weather. These are normal conversations we're having. We have to find ways to make this normal too. So if you're listening to the radio or watching television or a video game with your child, you're going to have opportunities on a daily basis to turn to your child and say, do kids talk like that in your school? What would you say if somebody said that to your friend? How do you think that would make your friend feel if someone said that to them? So you can just normalize that conversation. You want to give people concrete, easy examples to lower their inhibitions about talking about things. Sometimes you need to spell it out, right? Now, my first example, I know it makes people cringe a little bit, but let me tell you, this might not get printed by a reporter, but I can't tell you how many different reporters I've said this phrase to, and they have stopped and said, I never thought about it that way. So it's an educational phrase, even if it doesn't get printed, which is fine with me. But spell it out for people. Just because alcohol or drugs involved doesn't mean there was a miscommunication. A miscommunication is like, meet me at the corner of front and second, and somebody shows up at front and third. That's a miscommunication, not penetrating another person's genitals with your own body. That's an intentional action. Or spelling out prevention, that we all have the ability to look out for one another's safety. and then give a bystander intervention example or two. So just make it chewable, present it, paint the picture for people, explain what our catchphrases mean, break them down into those more robust definitions. So here's a little list of some terms that I think we use a lot in our field. And these are all important terms, but they're not terms that necessarily relate to other folks. Take a minute and think about them, and then if you have a few you want to add, feel free to shout them out. Primary prevention, yep. Title IX, nice. Gender-based violence could be one, yep. What was that? Trauma-informed is great, yeah. And sexual assault or harassment. Now, we find those are a little bit better, but as we found yesterday, we find that saying a trilogy works better than saying one. And this is even where, for us, saying the word sexual violence, it's in our agency name. You know, we have to retrain ourselves a little bit. But when we know that we may have defined sexual violence as a continuum encompassing everything from non-touched all the way up to very violent assaults, we know what we mean, but we also know when we say that term to the public, they only think about physical assaults. So it works better if you say like sexual harassment, abuse, and assault, or sexual misconduct, abuse, and rape. So spell out the spectrum, like hit those marks along the spectrum instead of using one word. That's more effective. Yeah. Oppression and anti-oppression? Yep. Yep. Okay, so I have to put on my glasses here. Nope, got it. Actually, I think we have most of sexual harm is another one. A consent violation is another one. So there are a lot of things that we find ourselves saying a lot, right? What was that? Evidence-based. Yeah, I don't even want to try to. I'll ask you to describe that one, Patrick. Okay. So what we'd like you to do a little bit here is practice. You have your blank worksheet. Everybody's first two words on the worksheet should be different than the person next to you, and it's intentional. We'd like you to take a moment. Did somebody? What was that? We just want you to be quiet while you do your exercise. What we would like for you to do is take a few moments to look at the two phrases that are the first ones on your sheet and think about different ways to say them that might explain it or might use more simplified language, an alternative term that's better known. So that would be like gift of fear versus heebie-jeebies. You know, you're not really explaining anything. You just pick a different term that means the same thing. I don't know. Maybe we can go explore. So take a few minutes, and you might have more than one example for yours. Like there's no right answer. There's a lot of right answers. So we want you to generate some of those things. And then at the very bottom, we have the opportunity to practice responding to some common questions with simple phrases. And we'll put up another slide for that. So just take a few moments and look at your first two words and figure out if you can come up with alternative ways of saying them that are more plain language.
So how we define the problem affects how our audiences think about solutions. So I guess the takeaway is resist the urge to push it all into one soundbite. There's got to be opportunities for people to get on multiple on-ramps to where the direction we're going, which is prevention and ending sexual violence. But if we don't create those moments for them to sink their teeth into it and want to learn more and stay hungry for that information, we've just overloaded them and shut them down. And I think an important takeaway is the thinking about being comprehensive and strategic, right? You can be one or the other, but you can't be both at the same time. So how do you pick your battles? How do you choose who you need to impact the most with the message at hand and choose your audience very carefully? So if it is that, that fence sitter, that person you just want to sway a little bit to step down off of the fence, would that be the same message that you would give to someone who may be in an opposition, a direct opposition to you? Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe you'd choose different words. So just being very thoughtful about that as we're thinking about that. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach at all. We can't have a magic bullet of words and a list, but we can be more thoughtful about the way we organize the words.
So I think we've hit on this as we've gone through some of these, but think about, like, if you're preparing, you're going to have different examples to talk to parents than you might have if you're talking to somebody in a business setting about harassment. But you want to walk in the door with 3 concrete examples of what you mean by what prevention can look like, right? So just have some in your back pocket. That aspirational language is important, but you don't want to overshoot. You want to, help people understand that they can be part of the solution and that those little everyday things that they're doing matter, and give them a concrete example of how. So we're really meeting them in a place that they're able to connect with us. Do you have a question?
I can try. Hold on.
Maybe you're going to get here, but we've been challenged we've been trying to talk about the aspirational piece better, and I've been challenging myself not to use the word prevention, which I don't think people really get anyway. And I'd just be curious about what you're finding around language where people have a clue what you're actually talking about.
So some of those aspirational things would be that's where you could pull out shared values, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. None of us want to think that we have neighbors who do these things. All of us value keeping our children safe. All of us want to be able to trust the teachers in the school. Or, we want to believe our children are safe when we're giving them into the care of other adults. So that's where you can start with some of those shared values and helping people recognize that, you guys you're in common ground, and that there's hope in doing something different. Real quick here, since we've got the BMSG people in the room. Do you want to say anything additional about the aspiration from your research to answer her question?
Where am I going? Bosses.
Well, one of the things we found particularly in the qualitative research, doing focus groups and all that kind of thing, is that as Kristen and Julie mentioned earlier, people often aren't quite on board that prevention is even possible. This is a new thing for them, and there's a common frame that sexual violence is just an inevitable part of life, that there are just bad apples out there, there are monsters, whatever. It's not something that's changeable. And so when they hear things like, we're going to stop all, we're going to, and so when they don't understand how their particular, how is changing what I'm doing in my school going to end sexual violence? That doesn't feel reasonable to them. And so you have to, and so we found that aspirational language that's very, it can be inspiring for us in the movement and that kind of thing, but when you're talking to folks who are not familiar with that, you need to acknowledge their skepticism and acknowledge their doubts about what's possible.
So you might want to think about, to go with that school example, to talk about whether or not it's an environment where people think they can get away with it, right? That you can relate to. So what can we all do to communicate through our actions and our words that this is something you can't get away with here? That's going to make it a hostile environment that lacks opportunities for people. So that's how you can change one environment. And it's not it's not like the whole, it will never happen here, but saying, like, we know that there are things that we can do. We know that there are things we've seen work in other environments, or that the one example that we've had shared with us from folks that are working with counseling people who've perpetrated sexual offenses. You know, they did it in 3 of the 4 former employers, and when they were asked, why didn't you do it in the 4th one, they said, I knew I couldn't get away with it there. So you can share stories like that to help people recognize people who commit these acts are also assessing the environment about whether or not they can get away with it. So it's our job to make it harder to get away with it. So to help create some concrete examples, it's important to describe the change you want to see. I should have looked ahead in the slides, because here we go. It's another way to break down maybe and answer that question. So if you want to help people feel connected to the possibility of making this work, who should take action, what they need to do, when they can do it, where they can do it, and why it's the right approach. So I pulled out a quote from a news article that covers these 5. So here's an example. We live in a culture that is saturated with disrespectful words and behaviors between men and women, and we need to put our efforts into replacing those. If you're watching TV, playing video games, or listening to the radio with your children, you have constant opportunities to pull out a lyric or discuss a theme and ask them, does this happen in your school? What did the kids say about it? What would you do if this happened to your friend? So this is the who should take action. This was an article that was about what parents can do. What should they do? Use everyday opportunities to raise the conversation and normalize it with kids. When should they do it? Whenever the opportunity arises. It happens all the time. You've got some examples every day. Where will it happen? Your living room, driving to school, wherever you are that you have these examples come up. Why is this the right approach? Because we need to replace the common bad behaviors and expectations with examples of what's respectful and what it looks like to care for one another. Right? Back. So sometimes it's easy for us to go off topic, or for that conversation that ensues to have a lot of questions, or people challenge maybe what you're presenting to them. And so, or even maybe they're asking a question that is likely to take us down the path that you don't want to go, right? You want to stay focused on prevention. You don't want to talk about risk reduction, or you don't want to talk about debating which study was the most accurate in their methodology, right? So we have to kind of bring it back. So we do have some examples for you on a handout that you can take home, but there are strategies to stay focused. So number 1, you don't want to repeat the myths or the bad ideas. So you just sort of want to redirect back to what your point is. So when somebody might challenge you about, we really need to talk to college students about not binge drinking. Sure. Or how do we get victims to report? How are we going to convince these victims to report right away so that we can take it seriously? We get this question a lot. So some examples we would have up here is, we can't talk about what victims should do without talking about what the rest of us need to do. We know victims aren't reporting because they don't trust the rest of us to respond appropriately. So if we want victims to respond the way we want them to, we need to respond the way victims want us to, right? So you're just gonna bridge right back into it. You can answer quickly and move on. So if somebody presents you with a piece of misinformation, no, but in fact, just correct it. So you don't have to stay on it or explain it, just boom, move away from it. What I can tell you is, what we know to be true is, what repeat studies have shown us is, what we know from 40 years of listening to victims is. So you can qualify what that fact is and just stay right on your fast track into what it is you want to say. Another thing you can do is to flag what is most important in the conversation, right? So you can emphasize your key points. You can say, What we want you to walk out of here today knowing is, you just told the room the most important thing for them to understand. Our primary concern, what the survivors we work with say they wish other people knew is. So find a way to really amplify what that important message is you want people to walk out with. That's like in a presentation. If you're talking to a reporter, that's telling the reporter, like, pay attention, I'm about to give you the nugget for your quote, right? This is what's most important. We have some other examples there on your paper. And our guide that we just released, where we're going and where we've been, has full appendices in the back. So you're going to get robust examples there. Sometimes it's helpful to recognize the discomfort that's making people challenge you. So there's nothing wrong with saying something like, we know that this may sound new to you, but what we know to be true is. We know this is hard to talk about, but it's important because. So you can recognize and validate some of those feelings of discomfort.
We have a list.
We have a list.
There's a list.
So we had this slide up before. It's here a second time because it's really important that I flag for you that we don't repeat myths. So I think that a lot of times when we are doing education or talking about our topic, people say to us, what are the common myths? Do you find that, are people still asking you? Because I get asked by reporters all the time, what are the myths that people still believe? Me Too has made a difference, but what are the myths people still believe? So you don't have to answer that the way that they're asking it. You can rework your sheets, rework your comments, rework your web page, and practice about how you only answer with the facts. So when people say, what are the myths? You can say, most people don't realize that this is true, and that is true, and this is also true. Just tell them what the facts are. One of the great things about only talking about the facts is that you are demonstrating to anybody in your audience that you know your stuff, that you don't buy into it. It's a great way to validate victim experiences because when you talk about the facts of what it's like to experience things or how common these are, what normal reactions are, people are going to be connecting because, again, that's their experience. So it is a way to present your organization and what you do as something that's trustworthy for people that are always looking for that safe harbor. It's also a wonderful way to provide some education about offender behaviors, right? Because what do we know to be true about this issue is that many people do not understand the choices, that there's strategy, that people do things for different reasons. It's not a single group doing things for a single reason. So we have to do a better job of getting good information to the public to help them understand a little bit more about this crime, often being intentional, choiceful, strategic. Even if it's if there's a strategy about when, where, and how people take advantage of an opportunity, right? So when we practice only providing facts, it's a nice way to tell people something that they need to learn and then pivot to prevention because you're giving them something concrete to understand. These are some examples. These are on the handout you can take home. But I will tell you, I know we've said it again, practicing is what will help you to just practice. Question?
But these are our 6 components from the messaging guide that BMSG has helped us to navigate and craft. And when thinking about your message, these are really great checkpoints, in what you're doing. So how do we evoke the shared values? What are those shared values? Like innovation, caring for the next generation, safety, protection. Like where are those universals that, I can't imagine going to a room and people being like, I don't care about children. I don't care about puppies. No, these are things that we all share, right? Like, you can tap into those shared feelings. And there has to be this acknowledgement sometimes of the negative feelings. Like, how do we work through the discomfort, fear, the lingering doubts by acknowledging them? There's some truth and reconciliation with that, right? How do we get to the describing the journey? That there's a starting point, pivotal moments. How do we navigate those feelings and show that change has taken place over time, right? Like having an aspirational mission like ending sexual violence in one generation and then learning all about the research that says aspirational things might not quite get us to where we need to be. Sometimes with certain audiences, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. But the lingering doubts, we don't address them, they just stay in the room with us. So when we state the problem precisely, and that's where you have to do the resistance work of not saying everything all at once. So pick one aspect or one part, say it really, really well. Then there's also the success and the concrete solutions. How do we get to that? And the data should be used as a 4-letter word here. Like data, as we've said before, we're not talking necessarily about statistics. We can show success in things like increased in reporting, because we know that that's a marker of something is changing, right? We don't have to say that now we have one in this many or this much percentage increase, because that doesn't give us what we need. The simple message is we know we're seeing success because, right? So what are the tangible examples of prevention approaches in action to get us to that concrete solution? I always think about bystander intervention. I know that's one of our words that we're not supposed to say. But every time I talk about bystander intervention, someone's always thinking like caped crusader, Wonder Woman coming in with the lasso of truth. And we're not talking about that. What are those really simple things that break it down, that get people thinking like, oh, I could do that. Like, that's super easy, right? I'm going to spill my drink. I'm going to say, are you okay? We've all done them, right? We all know what they are, and it helps people contextualize in a way that they may not have been before, because they're thinking big cape solutions, and we're saying everyday actions. So how do we get back to that everyday actions to help people see that they can do that very easily, and that systems should be doing that campuses should be talking in this way, that organizations and companies should be taking this on in very tangible ways, and not just superficially.
If you each have, you may or may not, but if you have personally done something as an action of bystander intervention, you have a story that hits all of these things, right? Yeah. You can say, here's an example. I was someplace and I saw something that made me really uncomfortable. When you describe it, it's probably going to make the other people in the room uncomfortable, right? Like whether that's a parent having a meltdown on it, or a kid who's having a meltdown in a store and the parent's about to lose it. We've seen that. We've seen parents losing it. Some of us have seen examples of verbal abuse between partners. So sometimes we've seen things. So when you describe what made you uncomfortable, you're sharing that evoking that shared value. This is something uncomfortable. You can acknowledge your discomfort by even saying, this is my job, and I hesitate. I felt myself hesitate. I did that thing where I stopped and said, is that person laughing or crying, even though I knew instinctually they were crying? So give that example. That's concrete. That's describing your journey towards change. I realized I needed to do something. You've stated the problem. You're going to state exactly what you did by giving that concrete example of, are you okay? Or I called the police, or I asked somebody for directions. Whatever your intervention was, and illustrating a success of, what the outcome was, if you had it. Or even if it's just you walking away saying, I don't know what happened afterwards, but I hope that person recognized that I was there to help them. And that maybe that was the first time somebody intervened. So if you've done anything like that, you already have one example in your back pocket of how to go through that quick series of steps.
You could even go back to a shared value with that too.
Yeah.
Like, I hope that person realized it's on all of us to look out for each other, because that's what we're here for, right?
Okay, so some stock phrases. These are on your handout to take home. Different ways to pivot to prevention. Because a lot of times we hear people say, or we see on the news, talk show hosts saying things like, well, what do we say to the parents who are doing a bad job, or what do we say to the parents who X, Y, or Z? So this is how you expand it. We're not going to get into shaming an individual family or person or whatever, but it goes beyond parents. It's every adult's responsibility to protect children. That's a shared value. And now you're going to launch into the rest of your prevention message. I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about a group that sometimes gets forgotten. This is a great way to bring in issues that we term under intersectionality, but we want to make sure, and we're flagging the importance that we're talking about this. We can't leave it out of the conversation. We need to hold people accountable and systems accountable, because these things don't happen in a vacuum. I don't know about you, we're based in Pennsylvania, so this grand jury report with the Catholic Church is like pretty all-encompassing right now, and this is it. It's this debate of these were individual actors, why are you going after the church? Well, no, there is institutional responsibility and institutional accountability, so you can all use that as you go home and talk about what's in the news right now. But these are really some good stock phrases about how do we keep broadening it, that this is a shared value, a shared responsibility throughout our culture.
Mm-hmm. We have a question.
I went too many. There we go. Framing the perpetrator. And they said, don't be cheeky, because we're not framing people. But
I just got that.
we do want to practice framing our information with language that keeps the responsibility for the actions where it needs to be, right? So who here has not seen Jackson Katz in a video or in person? Anybody in the room? Only one or two. Okay. Jackson Katz, he does a wonderful presentation of how we use very neutralized language to talk about sexual and domestic violence. And this is really a variation of the same kind of thing, that many of us answer questions truthfully, correctly, but in really neutral ways that don't reinforce that, that there is actually responsibility for the things that we're talking about. So we're going to give you some examples of the differences between the two, so you can, again, have one more thing to practice. But this is really trying to figure out how we can educate the community on the dynamics of abuse and violence. This is really a key component of prevention, helping people understand how these things happen, understand those these don't appear out of the air, they aren't miscommunications, these are choices people make. Mm-hmm. When you do that, it inherently demonstrates support for victims and survivors because you're speaking truth to what they experienced. And you're also inherently debunking myths without needing to restate them or draw them out, but it's another way of presenting facts. So we have a couple slides, and you have a handout. So this is a question, why doesn't she just leave? We get this a lot around domestic violence. So some examples, we say these things all the time. These are all true answers. Victims are scared to leave. The risk of homicide increases when a victim attempts to leave. Victims are often financially dependent upon the abuser. It often takes an average of 7 times before a person leaves permanently. Many victims have low self-esteem. It can be difficult to imagine life on their own. None of those things are untrue. But we just said nothing about the manipulation, control, and emotional and verbal abuse that makes those things true. So you can say the true answers in slightly different ways by saying abusers often repeatedly threaten to harm or even kill victims, their children, pets, or other family members. That's a different way of saying victims are scared to leave. Abusers have demonstrated the danger of going against their wishes, right? It's true. Abusers frequently control finances as a way to prevent victims from having independence. Abusers tell victims they are stupid, worthless, and unable to live on their own. They intentionally erode a person's self-esteem. So now you've answered the question, but you're keeping the framework there and reminding people this isn't a problem with the victim who's making bad choices. This is a problem with the way that the offender, the abuser, is treating that person. It's a normal response to abnormal treatment. Drinking on campus. We hear this a lot, right? Well, when everybody's drinking, things get out of hand, right? So some of our neutral talking points that we use a lot: sexual assault should not be the norm on campus. It should not be an expected part of a campus experience. We may tell people the truth. Alcohol is often correlated, but it doesn't cause assaults. That is true. Victims are never to blame for their assault, even if they're drinking. True. Risk reduction for sexual assault and binge drinking is important, but it's not enough. True. Did we just say anything about the way that people strategically use drugs and alcohol to facilitate sexual assault and educate our community about that? So you can say the same thing slightly differently.
And Kristen,
yeah?
doesn't this feel really comfortable too? We've all said these things. This feels super comfort zone for me, right? So that's the challenge. Like, we have to, the self-editing, you know, the cowbell. I just want you to, like, cowbell. Think about the self-editing, because this doesn't feel awkward at all. This feels really comfortable. Push against that.
But remind folks, people who commit acts of sexual violence often are using drugs and alcohol strategically. We all know increased victim vulnerability is the obvious one. But we also know many people who are about to do something that they know is socially unacceptable. Sometimes, like, there's a truth to that saying about taking a shot of courage, right? People will utilize intoxicants to give themselves permission sometimes. They also know that the rest of us are less likely to take it seriously. This is a great talking point to end with, because what does this do? It segues right back into prevention being everybody's responsibility, right? If people are counting on the rest of us to not take their behavior seriously when drugs or alcohol are involved, as long as we keep acting like it's not as serious, we're helping them out. This is why it's important that we all do blah, 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 right? You go right back into your prevention message. Delayed reporting, inconsistencies in victim stories. We hear this a lot when we have something like the grand jury report coming out right now. All these people are saying, why did people not say anything for 40 years? What if there's inconsistencies? We can neutrally say, most victims of child sexual abuse don't tell anyone, especially not when they're kids. That is true. It's normal that victims don't fully disclose all of the details. Sometimes survivors only have partial memories, but as they get support and feel safe, more memories return, or they get clarity, or they link together in ways that finally make sense. Many victims don't think they'll be believed. Those are all true things, but we're leaving out the manipulation that adults utilize. So we can say, adults who are sexually abusing children may have told the child that they have a special relationship that other people won't understand. They may tell children that nobody will believe them, and may go out of their way to demonstrate in other ways that adults believe adults over children. Sometimes people that sexually abuse children will scare the victim by telling them something bad will happen to them or to their families if the child tells the secret. Abusers may manipulate the cognitive limitations of a child to make them feel responsible. Many times people who are abusing children get them to break other rules that they know they'll get in trouble for, such as consuming drugs or alcohol, staying out past curfew, going somewhere they're forbidden to go. They do that on purpose as a way to keep the child quiet. So you can tell the truth, but that second set of answers goes so much further in helping people understand how these things happen. And it's a little more impactful.
And if we don't invite this other part, if we don't invite this side, then the person who caused harm is never in the picture, then we're never getting to the fact that sexual violence is not an inevitability, right? Mm-hmm. So how we get to there, I feel is important to uplift. Like, if we don't invite that in, sexual violence is just something that happens. And we never want that to be the resounding message to end on. Sexual violence is not something that just happens.
Again, here on the second side where we're including offender responsibility, you can pivot to prevention out of any one of those, right? So, talking about that they may be manipulating children, telling them no one else will understand or believe them. That's why it's important that adults ask questions when they hear something that sounds a little surprising or shocking, right? Guide people into what that corrective behavior might be.
Or that's why it's on adults to call in behavior. If you see Timmy's coach spending an awful lot of time with him, you can put him on notice and say, I see you spending a lot of time with that child. Have you done anything other than put somebody on notice that you're aware of their behavior? No, you're not accusing them of anything, but how do we have those little segues is really key to show a concrete solution.
Right. So, I can't believe it. I feel like high-fiving Julie. We totally hit it on the time. Oh my God. All right. I really want to thank you all, number one, for your questions, for participating, for sharing your great ideas with each other. We will make sure that the handouts are available online after the conference, and most of the slides, if not all of them. Our contact information is here if you need to reach out if you have questions, but thank you very, very much. Pick up the guide if you haven't yet in the resource room.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.